Thank you very much, Carol. I just want to say, Tim, what a pleasure it is to have you back. I regard Tim as our most distinguished alumnus. I'm very proud that he had his original education at La Trobe University, and he's not only a very distinguished scientist and what I think of as a patriot in struggling now in this area of climate change, Australia's future, but he's one of those rare scientists who's also a very great writer. His book's absolute delight. I was telling Tim before that the weather makers on one very hot summer's day a few years ago was the first time I really took seriously and began to read seriously in the area of climate change. So I'll just say this, every time we talk, the situation is slightly different, and also you have a new role.
That's right.
And perhaps the most obvious place to begin is to talk about your new role as the Chief Commissioner of the Climate Commission. What is it? Who's in it? What does it do? Can we start with that?
We can, but you've just started me thinking now about the very first time I came here, and I think it would have been 2009, Rob, if I remember correctly, and it was prior to the Copenhagen meeting.
Yes.
At that stage I was chair of the Copenhagen Climate Council. It must have been early in the year, I think, because I remember there being some optimism about getting a global treaty through. And then we met after that, it must have been 2010, when I'd stepped down from the council but didn't have the role I have now. And that was a very different political environment.
Yeah.
Now it's 2011, here we are, yeah. But well, this role is different, and I should just preface it by saying that when we dissolved the Copenhagen Climate Council in February 2010, the members of the councillors had come to the understanding that we had done everything we could at the international level in the role we were, and that it was time to dissolve that council and for us to all go back to our nations, to our countries, and to try to make sure that our countries would honour the pledges that were being then made under the Copenhagen Accord. Now, Australia had made a pledge to reduce its emissions by 5% below 2000 levels by 2020, which in real terms, because of the growth in the Australian population and economy, is about a minus 29% cut, so yes, nearly a third, which is very substantial. Supported by both sides of politics, it was always going to be tough. Yeah. So the only way to do it is through decent legislation. We knew that. So earlier this year, Minister Combet approached me and said that the Gillard government had made an election promise that they would set up the Climate Commission. The promise had sort of got lost a little bit because it was made at the same time they said they'd set up this Citizens' Assembly, and that got all of the media. But the Commission was nevertheless a very real promise, and he'd asked me if I would lead it, be the Chief Commissioner. And reflecting on things, I ended up saying yes, as long as I could have a hand in who was going to be on the Commission and so forth. And we started work in February. The commissioners include, there's 6 of us, and we have a diversity of expertise on the commission. Professor Will Stephan and Professor Leslie Hughes are 2 of the world's most respected climate scientists. Stephan in the area of climate modelling and the global Earth system, and Professor Hughes in the area of impacts, particularly biodiversity impacts and adaptation. We also had Roger Beale, who's an economist, very eminent economist in the area, had a science communicator, Susanna Elliott, and finally a businessman, Jerry Houston, who had just stepped down as the chair of BP Australasia. So it was an interesting mix. The brief for the Commission is to get out among the Australian community and lead discussions on all aspects of climate change, whether it be the science, the economics, or the politics, particularly the international level. We decided we would not comment on policy, and we were initially constrained by not being able to comment on government policy, and we sat down and had a think, and we thought, well, if we're not going to comment on government policy, we really need not to comment on policy at all. And the reason we did that was we felt that if we gave away the power to do that, we would gain some authority as a truly independent body, an independent voice, authoritative voice in this area. We are independent of government. We're funded through the government, but we don't report to the minister or anything else. So that's the way we've been constituted. We go out every 2 weeks into the Australian public, the hinterland there quite often, and talk to people about this. And our typical meeting schedule runs a bit like this. We go out, we have a dinner perhaps with local political leaders. The next morning we go and see a business. We might go to a local high school. We then have a meeting, lunch meeting perhaps with an influential group. It might be Probus or it might be the Lions Club or whatever. And then perhaps visit another business and then go on to a town hall meeting. And by the time we get to the town hall meeting, which is open to all of the public, we know quite a lot about the community and its issues. And then the next morning we might have a business breakfast and then we go. So that's how we do our work. We have other products as well as those meetings. We write reports, and the first report we released was called The Critical Decade. Thank you for calling this Critical Decade. It's a report on the science of climate change. It was released in Parliament House on the 24th of May. We had a very good turn-up of politicians at the meeting, including Malcolm Turnbull, Greg Hunt, the Prime Minister, various ministers, the Treasurer, the Greens, Tony Windsor. Very good turn-up. The science in the paper was supported by both sides of politics, which is what we're trying to achieve. To get bipartisanship is worth its weight in gold in this issue, and surprisingly there is quite a lot of it. There's agreement on the target, there's agreement on the mandated renewable energy target, there's now agreement on the science, which is good to see.
And can I ask just on that, why this decade is critical?
Well, we called it the critical decade because if you look at the trajectory that we need to achieve to avoid dangerous climate change, it entails the developed nations like Australia and the US turning their emissions curve downwards by the end of the decade. So if we get a minus 5% result, that's what we'll be doing, turning it downwards. In order to give some of the large developing countries enough time to turn their emissions trajectory curve downwards the following decade, and then the rest of the world the decade after that. So that is the sort of broad architecture, if you want, of the deal that we're looking at. But very, very important. This decade is critical for us. If we don't do that, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult for us to remain below 450 parts per million or 2 degrees of warming. So that's why it's a critical decade.
Now, I take from what you've said, you've been going out to different communities, different places. It's probably an impossible question, but can you do a field report about what the natives think?
Yeah, I think I can. It's been really interesting. That for me has been by far the most interesting bit of the exercise, hearing what people have got to say. And it's remarkable because if you listen to the political classes, you'd get a very different view of what was occupying people's mind in regional Australia. And I should just outline roughly where we've been. We had our initial launch down at Geelong. We've been to Mackay in Queensland, Ipswich just out of Brisbane, Armidale, Port Macquarie, Canberra, various other places. So we've seen quite a swathe. And I think we've been to Adelaide. I'm trying to remember, we were somewhere in South Australia, Playford in South Australia. The things we haven't heard. First of all, we have heard nothing about our broken election promises. I don't think there's been a question that I recall at least about the Prime Minister saying one thing and doing the other. That doesn't seem to be on the radar of the groups that we get. And I should just say the groups that come to us, they're broadly mixed. We might get 200 or 300 people. There'll be some welded-on climate skeptics. There'll be some deep greens, but a great range of people in the middle who are simply interested in the issue. So we don't hear much of that. We do have lots of genuine questions about climate science, and that I think reflects a broad confusion in the public about the basic science. There are lots of sources of misinformation out there, which we can perhaps talk about that later. That are causing problems. There are also many confused ideas about the economics of the issue, how best to deal with it, what sort of things economists as a whole agree on. There is also great confusion about what's happening internationally. People have very little idea really of what sort of instruments are being used overseas to reduce emissions and what the ambitions of various countries are and how they're tracking in terms of their pledges.
And an interest in where Australia stands in that.
Yes,
league,
absolutely. As it were. We hear some concern about climate impacts. How will this affect us in the coming decades? We hear concern for Australian industries, particularly trade-exposed industries. We also hear, though, at a very significant level, cautious optimism about what this might mean for us in our community. And we can see that playing out in some very interesting ways. In Mackay, for example, we went to a sugar refinery, and they're in a really tough business because they're competing directly against Brazil. As the Australian dollar is going up, the Brazilian real is coming down in value, Brazil's cleaning up. What this particular sugar refinery had done was used its waste products to generate electricity. And they'd done it through the mandated renewable energy target scheme, which is supported by both Liberals and Labor, which is good to say, both sides of politics. They're building a 40 megawatt electricity plant, providing a third of the electricity that Mackay needs, and giving that industry a whole new independent income stream. So as the sugar price goes bad, they've at least got something else to do. They're diversifying. So that sort of example in a community that's known as a coal port, because Mackay is known as a coal port, and you hear a lot of concerns about the future of coal, is really interesting to see. Yeah. And I think wherever we've been, we've seen that cautious optimism and interest in investment patterns in the future, particularly in regional Australia. People can see that they're going to gain from this. So I hope that gives a sense, broad sense of the sort of questions we get.
Can I just, one more question about that? There are two kinds of alarm which associated with debate. One is the alarm about what's happening to the Earth. Yeah. The other kind of alarm is what will happen to Australia or the economy or prosperity, so on. Is it possible to say which of those alarms, if either, is more important, do you think? Do you get many people who express alarm about the future of the Earth, or does it seem alarmist to think like that?
I would guess, doing a proportion, this is just off the top of my head, I don't have a statistical analysis behind me for this, but I reckon about 25% of the audience is concerned about the Earth, about 25% their foremost concerns for the economy, about 50% are cautiously optimistic about how they can make some money out of this, how the community can be improved through this. Yeah. So that's about how I think it cuts down. Could I say the one area that I haven't covered is the climate skeptics, and they're usually men, they're usually in their 60s or older. They usually sit either right in the front or off to the sides.
So we have to look now.
And we've had all sorts of reactions from the bloke in the front row who, in the first 5 minutes, stands up with a lovely piece of theatre, rips up the paper that we've given out, throws it into the answer, this is all bullshit, and walks out, through to those who will simply argue over the top of people, both the commissioners who are trying to respond to a question and to other members of the audience, but they are often shouted down by other people in the audience who just say, at least let him answer, So we've got security at all of the events. It's got harder recently for me personally to sit up there and do this. Just because you see the events in Norway and you see the hate that goes on in the media against commissioners, not just me, but a lot of us, and it does get harder to do it because there is that very small element of risk, particularly when you're in areas where there's strong feelings about this.
Can we talk a little bit about that? It seems to, I know there have been recent cases in which threats have been directed against climate scientists, which has been reported, and they must have made a decision to do that. It's clear also from quite a lot of talkback radio and tabloid newspaper columnists who will remain nameless, everyone in the city knows to whom I'm referring, have created a sort of atmosphere almost as if it's a kind of treachery to something or other to be concerned, as you are and many are, with the question of climate change. I suppose partly if I can ask you how personally that's affected you, the kind of rising level of toxicity in the debate, and also I suppose to ask you why you think it's happening.
Well, look, it does have an impact personally because much of it is in the nature of character assassination. So Andrew Bolt and others who are relentlessly negative about a person and are negative about their motives and whatever else is a form of character assassination. And you really feel that when you're standing in front of an audience, particularly in, say, regional Australia where the media options are limited, where that's what they tend to get. And you get that reflected back in the audience as an initial distrust. Thank heavens we break that down fairly quickly, I think. But there is an initial distrust that we are evil, unlikable, duplicitous people. And you realise that in that audience there's a mixture of people from the very stable through to the unstable. But you are playing with fire a bit when you do that. When you go into year after year of relentless character assassination, focused on the person, not the issue, I think you're just elevating the risk that something will happen.
And do you have a sort of explanation? I think even 2 or 3 years ago it was far less of that. There was a sort of what I call denialism. Even that term is now meant to be not able to be used, but I'll go on using it. But I think 2 or 3 years ago, at the margins, there was a sort of toxic politics, but not at the centre. I mean, in 2007, John Howard thought it was irresistible that something had to be done. So there's been a really big shift in the climate of opinion in this country and in the United States. And I suppose, because you're at the centre of this politics, I wondered if you have a kind of theory as to why it's happened.
Sure, I know why it's happening. It's happening because they don't have a case to prosecute. They don't have an argument. You see them picking pathetically at some opinion of some scientist or some retired scientist without expertise in the area, trying to bolster a case, when all anyone needs to do is go to the peer-reviewed literature and to the academies of sciences and their statements. And if I could just explain that a little, because people don't understand what that's really about. The peer review process in science involves me writing a piece of research, or someone else writing a piece of research, sending it to a journal to be reviewed. Now, the journal has nothing at all except its reputation. That's all journals have, is their reputation. That's why they exist, right? So the editor is very aware of that. He will often send that piece of work out to the most rigorous assessors he can find, who often have a different opinion on the view under discussion. And what those people do is go through that piece of work to make sure it all adds up. Do the figures add up? Is the physics right? Is the chemistry right? Is it concordant with what's been published before? It's like an auditing process, like a business, right? Doing an audit. Right? And at the end of that, you get a fully audited document that then goes into the literature, right? And then all of that material is brought together to form a view. The Academy of Science is very much like a journal. The Academy has absolutely nothing but its reputation, right? The reputation of every scientist who's a member of that academy in a place like Australia. So when they publish a statement on climate science, you can be sure it's the best case that there is. The Australian Academy of Science has published a very easily readable statement on what they think the state of climate change is. Anyone, anywhere in the world can go online instantly and read that. And so between the fully audited science that's available out there, the work of the academies, there is no reason for doubt. There's no excuse to go on picking at opinions that may vary on this. Anyone can check this stuff out immediately. Why would you believe an opinionist over the Australian Academy of Sciences or the peer-reviewed literature? And if they're not using the peer-reviewed literature, it's a bit like deciding to invest in a business without asking to see audited books. They've got unaudited books, would you invest in them? Don't invest in the climate debate unless you've had a look at the audited books. And then you're qualified to actually say something. If you're not, sorry, you haven't done due diligence. So that's the process that needs to go through. And the opinionists just refuse to see that. And they will go to Lord Monckton or someone else for an opinion which they tout as being credible when it's simply not credible. And when that fails, they simply attack people.
Can I just take this up a little bit and I'll say a bit first. I do not know of a case in liberal democratic societies in which a substantial body of science has been denied, repudiated, since Charles Darwin, I'd say, in which the challenge to a religious worldview seemed to be under threat. There may be other cases, certainly in totalitarian societies, science all the time is challenged. It's one of the most notorious aspects of totalitarian politics. So, and I would have a few years ago thought that it was in our sort of society, like the United States and Australia, inconceivable that this could happen, that a peer-reviewed science, a large body of it, with a more or less consensual centre and then disagreements on detail, that it would be challenged. It seems to me, anyhow, that there are two possible, many possible, but two main possible explanations for this astonishing turn of events. One is that the changes being demanded to move from carbon fossil fuel economies to different kinds of economies are so great that there's a natural resistance in body politic to make the change from a very comfortable, extraordinarily comfortable life to one that will require big change. The other possibility, and it's one that I must say I'm drifting towards, is that the industries involved, coal, oil, etc., have put enough money, seed money, into a propaganda campaign that has kind of now got a momentum of its own and has begun to, through radio and television and newspapers, transform opinion. So I suppose I'm now asking you, one of the very big questions is how something as large as very broad denial of something I think to be at the centre of our kind of society, which is science, how's that happened in your view?
Well, where lies the motive force? Where is the
Cui bono, the old question of politics, whose benefit?
Yeah, sure, yeah. And if you ask whose benefit, I think it's a little bit more complex than you perhaps think with the big industries funding this. Yeah. And that may well be the case, that there are certain industry interests not to do things. There are also very large industry interests to do things, and they're increasing. In 2009 was the first time ever that investment in renewable energy exceeded that in fossil fuels. Right? So we started seeing a big change there. So there's a big industry constituent for doing something. Right? I think that perhaps it starts, well, I think there's a few things. One is certainly the self-interest of the fossil fuel industries, and there's some money coming out of that. But I think you can't deny that there's an ideological basis here of action, because in order to deal with this issue, it is a global issue. We need some sort of global agreement. And there are a number of people, particularly in the US, who abhor any global agreement, and global government abhor government in general. Yes. So I think there's an ideological basis there for that as well. And the very libertarian end of the spectrum just don't like the idea that this is the case. There's also, in any debate that's set up like this, ecological niches, if you want to create it, or economic niches. So certain scientists who may be predisposed to denying this anyway, all of a sudden find they're being invited to speak or to be on boards or whatever, and it's very beneficial to them, very remunerative. Same with opinionists. If you're willing to line yourself up and decide to throw away your morals, well, then you can actually do quite well out of it. So I think that there's a whole series of things which have come together to create this.
Yeah. I mean, do you share my astonishment at the turn of events? Did you anticipate there would be this kind of reaction against science when you got into the field? And you told me before 1999, when you started reading the scientific journals carefully. Has it, I suppose I'm asking a personal question, whether this movement of opinion has been a surprise?
I don't think I've been surprised at the opposition. I think I sort of realised this was going to be a long, hard fight. What I've been surprised at is some of the politics of it, and just the way things have played out. I was kind of, I've been a bit surprised at. Yeah, I mean, while I was chair of the Copenhagen Climate Council, we saw amazing changes of, for example, India and China going from resolutely negative about it to now leading the charge in many areas. That sort of stuff, you wouldn't anticipate happening, but it in fact has. David Cameron's pledge to deepen his targets for the UK at a time of economic recession. Surprising, but there it is, it's on the table. The US achieving its target, minus 17% reduction pledged under the Copenhagen Accord. They're already at minus 9%. So, there's a number of things.
Because of the economic downturn more than...
Well, they're achieving it in the most expensive possible way, possibly by destroying the economy. But also there is some good programs in place and some good policies. The new CAFE standards for motor vehicles is a good example. So, you know, there's a number of things happening. I suppose you're always surprised at the details, but I don't think any of us should ever underestimate the difficulty of changing things. It's always been the most difficult thing, social change.
And so that, in a way, where your emphasis would lie on the difficulty of change.
Yes, I think so.
I mean, and two possible ways of thinking about that, again, I'd be interested in your view. I should say at this point, just before I say this, that there will be plenty of chances for questions, and you know, and I would hope that there is a vigorous question time, because you know, without that, these sessions will lack something. And what I'm going to do in a minute is put 5 devil's advocate questions, and as to you as the climate commissioner. But before that, just it seems to me, if it's true, I mean, James Hansen, the NASA scientist, says that in a book of his that I read a while ago, says that if human beings go on burning up all the fossil fuels available, and coal will be the last man standing, as it were, if they do that, then in his view it is inescapable that the poles will melt, and that he says a 75-metre rise in sea level, and he's thinking about hundreds,
thousands or tens of thousands of years.
I would think he's thinking of 300 or 400 years, but anyhow.
I think the mass of the Antarctic ice cap is so large and it's so high that I think we're looking at many tens of thousands. But anyhow,
but he does think that if you burn all the fossil fuel available, that will. So you know, these are big deals. And I just wonder, and it occurs to me, whether our domestic political systems and our international relations system is ill-adapted to coping with something as large as this challenge, and whether you think like that as well, or whether you think we will. I know at some deep level you think we will adapt.
Well, I think the political system's unformed. It is at that sort of level. The mechanisms don't really exist as yet to do it effectively, or perhaps we're starting to invent them with the Copenhagen Accord and the Cancun, improvements to it and so forth. It's in your area, Robert. This is politics. This is where the great innovations now have to happen. We've had the scientific innovations, or we're having them ongoing. We've had the economic innovations. We now have the instruments. What we lack is the political innovations that will allow them to be applied in an equitable and acceptable way. So it's about politics now.
You're going to leave it to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm going to now be the devil's advocate, and I've actually written down here my devil's advocate questions. So I'm going to now find them and put them to you, okay, one by one. And these are things that I have read very systematically. The Australian newspaper recently. These are the kinds of things.
You lucky person.
These are the kinds of things that the Chief Commissioner must answer. The first devil's advocate question is, Australia emits only 1.5% of greenhouse gases. Whatever we do, we will have negligible effects across the Earth, the globe. Why should we shoot ourselves in the foot?
Well, could I just say that, if you ask that question of any country, the answer would be the same. They're all only a small percentage. Even China's only 17%. Why should they bother doing anything when the rest of the world isn't?
83% elsewhere.
That's right, exactly. So, you can answer it. And it just underlines the fact that this is a global problem. It's a global issue. And what counts globally are two things. It's being stand up and being counted, and honouring your promises. That's what That's what counts. And we've all made promises under the Copenhagen Accord. We all have our targets. The moment now comes where we actually have to honour those targets, right? And honouring them will strengthen everyone else's resolve to honour theirs, and thereby begin this long process of reducing emissions. So both sides of politics agree with that. This is something that both the Labor and Liberal Party agree on. There's no doubt about that, just as there's no doubt about the science. Both parties accept the basic science. So we've just got to get on with the job now, and asking that sort of question misses the point.
Second question. And obviously people here can come back to it if they're so inclined. Second question, this is again taken from what is written every day in newspapers and said every day in right-wing blogs and so on. Climate scientists are a group of self-interested left-wingers. They have an interest in stoking public fears. They're called warmists and alarmists. And they stoke public fears in order to get poor taxpayers, already hard done by, to fund their research via places like this, universities.
Let's change a few words. Let's say that opinionists are in a conspiracy to defraud the public. Some opinionists are in a conspiracy to defraud the public of their the common good by making sure that the rich don't pay their taxes. I just think that's an opinion, and just as that is an opinion. And I would say to anyone who's written any of that, you have to actually substantiate it. Show me where the conspiracy actually is. Can you demonstrate, in fact, that all scientists are left-wing? It was interesting, I think it was Greg Sheridan recently said that I was a long-term friend of the Labor Party, which I was appalled at. There is not one shred of evidence that I'm a long-term friend of the Labor Party, not one shred. He could have at least pointed out that John Howard appointed me Australian of the Year. So these lies just get out there and are never questioned, just as these sort of assertions get out there and are never questioned. So, scientists are the ultimate sceptics, and I think we need to, as a public, develop a much more sceptical attitude to a lot of this stuff.
Do you think, this is not a devil's advocate question, it's a parenthesis to your answer. Do you think scientists are good at, as it were, defending themselves or making the case for their profession?
Well, by their own lights they are. I mean, for the Australian Academy of Sciences to come out with a statement on climate change that says, here's all the science, and their reputation rides on this, remember, this is what's critical. And for the Royal Society to do the same, and the American Academy of Sciences to do the same, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences to do the same, most of the major academies do the same, is a big deal.
Yes.
The problem is that people who get engaged with the issue don't automatically go there to find out what the facts are. They're quite happy to listen to an opinionist who's utterly unqualified in the area.
Yeah.
Why that is a strange thing, and I would just say it's about as sensible as deciding to invest in a business without asking for audited books.
Yeah, or the one is again in parenthesis, not the devil's advocate. I mean, it's like if one had a bout of cancer, to then canvass opinion amongst opinion columnists as to how you should be treated, as opposed to going the people that appear to know something. It strikes me as sort of so fanciful. But
yes. Well, look, just as the opinionists are really interesting, and the media is a big competitor. A friend of mine appeared on breakfast television fairly recently, paired up against someone who was supposedly a climate sceptic from the opposite camp, who was quite verbally agile and put this sceptic case quite effectively on television. Afterwards, my friend decided to research this fellow because he'd never heard of him. Turns out he was from New Zealand and he'd written one book, the title of which was Pawmistry, How to Read Your Cat's Paw. And this person had been accepted by the Australian media as having something important to say about climate change. Where are the sceptics? Bring them on, we need more of them.
Now, back to my devil's advocate questions. This is the third one. And this comes, you get a lot of this, is that essentially the left lost its bearings when the Soviet Union collapsed. And it was looking for a way to restore its attack on capitalism. Not having an alternative society, it had to look for something else. And it eventually found in climate change and climate science the way in which what is really their ambition, which is to destroy capitalism and the private enterprise society. So that really what they hate is capitalism and the idea of economic growth. Okay. And they've used climate change and climate science as a surrogate issue for what is in fact anti-capitalist left-wing politics.
Yes. Oh, well, that must explain then why Margaret Thatcher was the first political leader in the world to highlight the dangers of climate change, and it would explain why the Conservative German leader Angela Merkel has a very strong policy, and why in fact the Tory leader in Britain, the current one, has a very strong climate policy.
You know what they're saying about Margaret Thatcher now? They say that she wasn't sincere in her, because she really wanted to destroy the miners' union.
That's
what Nigel Lawson is now saying.
Yeah, well, we go through them all. What about BP? You know, I'm sure that the socialists would have been the ones who decided to have the reform to beyond petroleum, and I'm sure that all the investments we're now seeing made by right-wing, supposedly, or free market corporations into the new energy economy is part of that as well. So that's just ridiculous. And to be honest with you, I'm going to lose a friend here, I'm sure, but the whole left-right thing doesn't make any sense to me anymore. There's a different frame taking place in the way the world's politics is shaping up, and I think this is just a very tired old rhetoric, honestly, that's unthought through. Where are the sceptics? Where are the genuine sceptics who take these sort of assertions and run them and ground truth them against what's actually happening in the world? See, they appeal to some tired old ideology that if you accept means you don't have to think and you can just accept it. Whereas if you actually go through and say, well, does this make sense in light of this, this and this, you can get somewhere. But those sort of comments are deliberately crafted, I think, to stop people thinking, to appeal to prejudice and therefore stop them actually being sceptical.
The fourth, I suppose that the fourth thing is question, this is a more reasonable question, but I think it requires an elaborate answer, is that there may be some problem about the increase of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but people like yourself have exaggerated this enormously, that it's a relatively small, relatively handleable problem, which societies like ours are good at handling, and you're an alarmist. You're making it seem much bigger a deal than it really is.
My goodness, I've seen quite a lot of alarmism about the economic solutions that people are talking about now in the papers.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary how a new impost of any sort will destroy the Australian economy, destroy whole sectors of it, devastate it. So I'm not quite sure about this alarmist thing. But what I can say from a scientific perspective is you don't have to believe me, you don't have to believe Andrew Bolt. Go to the Academy and see what they've got to say. Go to the IPCC and see what they've got to say. And there you'll find a range of probabilities laid out, right? That at one end of the spectrum, at chances of 100 to 1, it may be that we are overestimating the potential impacts of the warming trend, At the other end of the spectrum, there's a chance of 100 to 1 that we're grossly underestimating them, right? Yeah. But the sort of stuff you see in the middle of the wedge, is what people like me are talking about. That's and if you map real world change and some of these trends against the projections, what we find for sea level rise, for the global temperature increase and the CO2 concentration increase, they're all tracking the top edge of the projections, the probabilistic projections, right? So that suggests to me that ground truthing indicates that at least for the early part of the projection curve, 2000 to 2010, we are underestimating the problem rather than overestimating it. So again, the real world data's out there. You can go and check it. You can have a look at it yourself. It's just an opinion.
Yeah.
And it might, at 101 chance, it might be right, but I'm not going to back it.
Yeah. I've got 6 devil's advocate questions. The fifth is this, which it actually segues from what you just said. If things are so dire, many people suggest, in a way, all action is futile. This is actually, I'm getting edgy now. This is a difference between you and a friend of mine, another friend, Clive Hamilton, who, in his book Requiem for a Species, gets close to the position that things are so dire that he just doesn't know, he doesn't think, I think, that human beings are going to be able to stop this locomotive. And he goes through some figures that even though Kyoto was agreed to and all sorts of limitations were agreed to, it's clear, isn't it, that emissions have continued to accelerate despite almost universal knowledge of the problem. And so you can get to the position of almost thinking that action is futile, that there's a kind of like a sorcerer's apprentice situation where things are now out of hand and moving so rapidly, and you have to then factor in the claims of the undeveloped and the developing world towards the prosperity and the well-being of Western societies, that we're just, there's nothing that can be done. We can pretend that we can do things, but in fact, we're in a situation essentially of tragedy from which there's no exit.
Yes, yeah. And look, I just respond by saying the science doesn't support that. It's a possibility, and I wouldn't deny that. It was a possibility that we are underestimating grossly the impact of these greenhouse gases on the system, and that it's already beyond the point of no return, which would be the way you'd express that. But the science, the probabilities, the balance of probabilities doesn't support it. But could I say furthermore that if you do come to that conclusion, you're dealing yourself out of the public discussion, because you've got nothing more to say. After that, it's hopeless, and that's it. Apart from the fact I don't think the situation is hopeless, I think that's the wrong thing to do. I couldn't. If I came to that conclusion, I think I'd just go and retire to a beach in Queensland and drink pina coladas, but I wouldn't really. Don't know whether I'd advertise it. But there's that. The other thing that's missed, of course, in those arguments is that did anyone actually expect emissions to start dropping in 2011? No. We didn't. We've got a game plan, right? It's been forged under the Copenhagen Accord and so forth, and it's a general understanding of governments that the developed countries will turn their trajectory curve down this decade, the large developing countries, the BRICS, the decade after, and the rest of the world the decade after. So we're not going to solve this problem tomorrow. We've got to live with the fact that we're going to see emissions grow for some time yet, but that we are putting the BRICS in place year by year, month by month, that will see us stay safe.
And do you think the 2-degree increase and nothing beyond that is a possibility still?
Yes, I do.
According to the figures?
Yeah, I do.
I mean, we can get technical, but it's probably not the right place to do that.
No, that's right. It's going to be tough, but I think if we don't act, if the developed countries miss their deadline for reducing emissions this decade, turning the curve down this decade, it becomes incredibly difficult. Yeah. But at the moment,
this is why it's the critical.
That's right.
The critical decade. And my sixth and final devil's advocate question is, and this is where you as a scientist and as an imaginative scientist, I think can play a really important role, is to think about, what people say, and again from reading newspapers, what I hear all the time, is that solar, tides, wind power, your one that you've written about quite a bit, hot rocks, all of these things may be at the margins able to supply energy, but they'll never have the capacity for baseload, for doing the thing that fossil fuels can do.
Gee, can I borrow your crystal ball? Love to look into it. Anyone who's so certain about the future is fantastic. I mean, God, I wish I was that certain. It's like the nuclear proponents who say it's absolutely nuclear, it has to be nuclear. I say, I'd love to see the crystal ball, Anyone who's bloody got that degree of foresight's truly extraordinary. But, what I can see with this is that, that those technologies have enormous potential. That's why people are investing in them so much, And we do know that we can create baseload power using solar now. The technologies are in with, I think, the liquid sodium batteries and so forth. They're not widespread, not widely deployed, and they're still expensive. But we know that technically we can do it. In Australia's case, for example, if you wanted to create something like baseload, one option is to string a high voltage direct current interconnector from Perth through to Adelaide. So you'd be taking in all of that southern wind region, and not only would you be doing away with 2 of the 4 daily peaks because of the time difference, so you wouldn't have all the peaking problems we've got now, you'd be harnessing a huge amount of wind power that blows continuously across pretty continuously across that southern region, and the wind takes quite a while to get from Perth to Adelaide, so you're creating something more like baseload than we've got at the moment. The cost of all of these technologies is coming down, but I'll tell you, the thing to watch with this is Germany, because I was there a couple of weeks ago with Siemens, and what you see there is that Germany's now decisively moved away from nuclear power. As a result of the Fukushima meltdown. They have determined to stick very stringently with their emissions reduction targets, so they're not going back to more fossil fuel. And that leaves only one option open, really, if they want sovereign energy security, if they want to have some sort of degree of national energy security, which is these renewable sources. Yeah. So they, in the next decade or so, will be pioneering, I think, the deployment of this at a scale which at the moment's unimaginable, to give something like baseload power. Now, they're lucky they're next to France, which has a lot of nuclear and there's a grid, there's some sort of the beginnings of a pan-European grid. There's also lots of cheap hydro in Norway, because climate change has brought more rainfall there, and they've got about 5,000 megawatts excess that they didn't have before. So there's a number of things happening that are sort of in their favour. But the undeniable fact is that country actually has to now really look seriously at that option. And I think we'll see some quite significant changes in terms of technology and cost in the renewables in the coming decade. I can't say which ones are going to win or anything else, but I can see now we've got a configuration of interests that are going to strongly push for that solution.
And it's true, isn't it, that China is investing a huge amount in my guess is in the hope to be the leader in the export of, say, solar technology. Is that...
Yeah, they're the world's biggest solar producer, they're the world's biggest wind producer. They're going ahead, they've got a very aggressive nuclear program. They don't want to be held hostage to fossil fuels.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions, then we'll open it up. It seems to me that if one thinks about Australia as a player in global terms, the biggest thing in our sort of national neck of the woods is coal. We're a significant coal exporter and major coal producer, and we rely on coal to a very large extent for our energy. The first question I have is whether you think clean coal is a fantasy or likely to, geosequestration is a fantasy or likely to be a real possibility for coal-producing countries and coal-reliant countries.
Yeah. I think it'll be very interesting to see how carbon capture and storage works out in Germany, whether that'll be part of their strategy. And I think we'll probably get some better insights into the global future of those technologies from what Germany decides to do. So at the moment, I think it's too early to say, but...
You've not ruled it out or ruled it in?
No, look, and it's clear that it comes with a cost, and that's it's a significant cost, but we shall yet see. And even if carbon capture and storage turns out to be cost prohibitive with coal, there is still the potential of using it with biomass, which gives you an overall plus because you're taking the carbon from biomass and putting it in the ground, and that's a huge carbon win. And with natural gas, where the volumes are smaller and a very efficient plant might give you the opportunity to do it. So we have to see these are complex technologies in a very rapidly changing energy world, and we just have to see how that plays out over time, I think. And in terms of Australian coal, could I just say, Robert, the Australian coal industry is going to be around for a while yet. The reason for that is that there's a huge new build in China for coal-fired power plants, which are very, very efficient. They're pretty much twice as efficient as our Australian plants, and Australian coal is relatively clean in terms of its ash content and so forth, and fairly close to market. And it's produced safely. It doesn't kill thousands of miners like it does in China. And for those reasons, I think there's going to be a market for Australian coal probably for the next quarter century or so in those areas. Beyond that, I think it's very questionable. But if you look at 20, 25 years...
And would you see the coal industry as over the decades dropping away?
Well, we know that by 2050 we've got to be living in an effectively decarbonised world if we want to avoid dangerous climate change. Now, if carbon capture and storage becomes a significant segment of the market in the next 40 years, they would still have a future. But conventional coal burning, I think, is not going to be there in 40, 50 years' time. But as I said, for the next 20 or 25 years, those plants that are between 5 and 10 years old in China, when they built so many of them, they're going to run for 50 years. And so, through that 40, 50 years, that period, there'll be a market for Australian coal, I think. And that's just the reality. That's the best, view that the economists can give me of it.
Yeah. I only got two more questions, and then we'll open it up. The first is, we slightly differed on this question. I felt that Copenhagen was a great disappointment. You were relatively more optimistic about what it achieved. I don't know your opinion on Cancun. But I suppose one of the questions is whether the United Nations and that kind of framework is going to be the fundamental framework, do you think, for the big agreements about international reductions in emissions, or whether some other sort of framework is going to emerge?
Geez, well, I walked into the chamber at the UN, the All Nations Chamber. It's a most extraordinary experience. First of all, the decor's all sort of 1970s and stuff. But the mindset's 1970s too, because the most important thing in that chamber are nations. Yeah? Every nation has a desk, except for the poor old Palestinians and the Pope, who've got a bloody little one on the side. Everyone else has got a desk. And whether you're San Marino with 3,000 people or China with 1 billion, you've got the same size desk. Right? So, and the votes are all one-to-one, so that it's not democratic in the sense that we're used to thinking about a democratic institution. And it's arcane, and small special interests can hold up the bigger countries that want to make decisions. I've thought a bit about this. I mean, the big innovations have to occur in the political sphere. That is clear. I'm yet to see what they would be. But to take a really long-term view of this, cooperation predates life. Yeah, these little molecules had together and cooperate to build the building blocks of life. Right? So cooperation is a fundamental force in our universe. It has brought us all the way from not just those few molecules cooperating, through to the first living cell, through to the multicellular organism, through to a society embedded in an ecosystem that's a global ecosystem. Right? Collaboration's brought us all that way, or cooperation has brought us all this way. So if you were looking at this as being, can we form a global consciousness that's capable of regulating the body that is the earth, so we're the brain, it's the body, and looked at it in terms of a marathon, we are about 2 paces from the finish line. Right? Most of the work's been done and behind us. The question now is whether cooperation in a conscious mind can be fostered at that global level. And I think even if you look at it at that limited space, most of the race is already over. The shift of taking a family of hunter-gatherers who were living like a pride of lions on the African savannah through to being part of even a village was a bigger shift than the one we're looking at now, in terms of what people have to give up. And the thing about cooperation, of course, it only works if you give something up. Yeah? You give up autonomy at every level, give up power at every level. Yeah? So we're just at the point now where the nations have to decide to give up some power to something else. Now, what that something else is, I don't know. It may be the people. It may be that this new information technology we've got will so empower people that we'll be able to have direct participative democracy at some sort of level, or I don't know, but something like that may be shaping up. But you guys can know more about that than I do. The politicians are the one who should be looking into the crystal ball, I think, trying to work out how to forge that next level of cooperation.
Yeah, and I know there are people in this room who are studying these things at the moment, and no bigger problem in international relations than, as it were, trying, wonderfully evocative picture you give of the possibility, but doing the thinking that, as it were, moves from that general possibility to making it real is, one of the most daunting kinds of intellectual problems that we can face.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, but in a funny way you've already answered. I will ask you, but you've already kind of answered, which is the question, the overwhelming question is, are you optimistic that we can do it? I think...
Yeah, look, I am optimistic, and I when I frame that question, and I wrote a book, Here on Earth came out of that, trying to answer that question. And at the very biggest level, you can try to justify your optimism or not by looking at the nature of the universe in a way. And, Fermi's paradox is a good place to start with that. Enrico Fermi was an Italian physicist who just asked a simple question. We look up at the night sky, so there's billions of stars out there. Why the silence? Why aren't we hearing from other intelligent civilisations? You know? And there's only two answers that I can see that make any sense to that question. You know, the first is that intelligent superorganisms like our global civilization are so unstable that they destroy themselves almost at the instant of their birth. So there's a very brief period where they can reach out to other worlds and send signals that can be read. And you've got to admit that's a possibility. The second possibility is that we genuinely are the first. That might seem unlikely, right, on a first principles approach. I don't think it is so unlikely. You know, the universe is 14 billion years old. It took 3/4 of that time, 3 whole generations of stars, just to create the heavy elements that are required for life, carbon and so forth. And it's taken all of evolutionary time since then to create us as we are today. And with much chance and hazard in that evolutionary process. So I think perhaps we are the first. Perhaps, as Alfred Russel Wallace said, that, you know, human destiny is to fulfil the human spirit in the vastness of the universe, and I think maybe that's right.
There are roving mics. I would ask questions. Would be much appreciated and of interest to us.
You've answered a few of the questions by saying that the science is all there and it's available in the peer-reviewed documents, and that we need to look to political innovations to take the next steps. But I ask you, do you see that there's a problem in that the scientific community hasn't taken responsibility for making sure that the scientific evidence is available in a way that is accessible to the entire community? Because I think most people would agree it's not necessarily the most plausible option that everyone in the population is going to go ahead and read these peer-reviewed documents.
Look, I think that the peer-reviewed literature is very voluminous, and trying to even make sense of it on a document-by-document basis is difficult. But what anyone can do is log on to the Australian Academy of Sciences website, or the Royal Society website, or the Chinese Academy of Sciences website, and read their statement on climate change. In the case of the Australian Academy of Sciences, special experts were brought in from outside to make sure that that was intelligible to the average person who logs on. It's very simple, very straightforward, very authoritative. There is no excuse for believing an opinionist over the Academy. It's as simple as that. So I think the Academy's done their job. I think the scientists have done their job. It's now up to others to say, I don't expect you to believe me. I don't expect you to believe him or her. Go to the experts and have a look at what the Academy has to say. And once you've done your due diligence, come back and talk about climate change, because before that, what do you say is just an opinion. It's not worth anything.
My question is going back to the discussion about the science of climate change. You were saying earlier about how when you were going into the towns there was a lot of confusion about the science, and I know that you've pointed out that you think the Australian Academy has done its job very well. But given the amount of confusion that there is in the public, whose job do you think it is to communicate this science to the people in a way that they can understand? And also, what are they doing wrong?
Sure. Look, I think that the communication's already done, right? It's sitting there on the website, it's sitting wherever. The confusion is really about who are the experts, yeah? And why are they experts? And I think we need to, anyone with an interest in this needs to take people on who express an opinion and say, well, it's fine for you to have an opinion, and I've got my opinion, but they're all equally useless unless you're really sceptical and look at the evidence and explain the peer review process to people. So I understand it's like an audit. You wouldn't invest in a company without doing an audit, looking at the audited books. And you would go to the experts, who's the only, what they have to lose is their reputation. That's all they trade in, is their reputation. So for them to put this up is a big deal, right? It's not like someone who's got no qualifications in the area blathering on the radio or on a blog about things. And so I think that's the discussion we have to have now about that. And my personal view is you're not qualified to speak on the area unless you've done your due diligence. It's like buying into anything, right? You've got to do your due diligence and make sure. If you haven't read the Academy's statement and you haven't taken on board what they say and can have a good reason for rejecting it, we don't want to hear from you. You know, you're welcome to have your opinion, but you've got nothing important to say in terms of the debate.
Can I say something about that? It seems to me take another area. Let's say, think about nuclear physics. Imagine a debate between, Philip Adams and Andrew Bolt on nuclear physics. I mean, it's sort of ridiculous. Everyone can have a view on what should be the implications of nuclear physics in terms of, this or that. But the idea that these questions that are so difficult should be, 800-word opinion columns, and that people have an authority, or put it another way, if someone clearly couldn't pass a first-year exam in any of the disciplines required, let alone having published or got a PhD in the area, why in the hell do we listen?
Yeah,
and then people say to me, well, you don't know anything about climate science. I'm a political historian. To which I answer, and these are the words of my friend Clive Hamilton, it's not what you believe, but who you believe. It seems to me what's happened, and this is really threatening our society, is that the understanding of where it is that, where opinion matters and where it is that one has to defer to those who know something has been lost. So that there's a really great danger we now face in the role of public reason and in the place of public reason in a democracy. And I think once that goes, then we're really at sea. We don't know what to believe and what to think.
No reference points.
No reference points. And this is sort of almost basic clear thinking about, I am convinced in most areas by those who I know something.
And Robert, there's a great debate to be had. I'm not trying to close down debate by saying go to the Academy of Sciences. What that basically does is lay out the basics. There's still a huge amount of political debate around the probabilities of particular events or the link between extreme weather and climate change. And all of those things, you can have a wonderful informed debate about. But the basic science, that's very hard to put up an alternative case.
It warms my heart, Tim, to hear you advocating the Academy of Sciences manifesto, and I urge everybody with questions to go to that website because it was written for you. But to get back to the reasons why people in Australia are doubting science, I was very interested to hear Rob say that this hasn't happened since Darwin. There are actually two medical questions that I think can inform us here. One was the smoking debate, and there it was very obvious that selfishness from big tobacco and people who like to smoke were the driving forces there. But the other is immunisation and the completely false claim that immunisation of children causes autism, which it obviously doesn't. And nothing seemed to be driving that, except possibly fear. Do you think fear is a big part of the reason that people don't want to accept the science? And do you think your strategy then of saying, well, we can actually do something about this and here's the plan, is going to combat that fear?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, if I could just say. And I think that what we're trying to do at the Climate Commission is to create a space for a calm and reasoned debate about this sort of thing. Because if people are fearful, you're quite right, they won't make rational decisions. You need to actually create a calm space for people to think through logically these things. And part of the right-wing media campaign, if you want to use right-wing, whoever they are, the anti-side of things, is to create fear so that people don't get the chance to think rationally through all of this because they don't have a case. They don't have a case. So all they can do is character assassination, fear and misinformation. Right? And that's, I think, quite right. They all go together. The second someone sits down rationally, calmly, looks at the data, you'll come to a different view.
Yes, thank you. Professor, I realise we're dealing with the situation in Australia here today, but may I ask, if you were running your commission in, say, Indonesia or China or Nigeria or some comparable country, how would you make your case there for people to be engaged in the exercise of seeking effective international control over climate change?
Sure. I think we'd be doing exactly the same thing that we're doing now. I haven't kind of gone through the entire mental process of trying to work that out, but the issues are the same. People need a comprehension of the basic science. They need to understand what the kinds of economic instruments are that are available for people as they seek to address this issue, and they need to have an understanding of where things stand internationally, you know. And I'm sure we do it in the same way of standing away from politics and trying to speak to the facts and trying to get bipartisan support for all of our products. And that's, you know, you can't always achieve that, but that's the way, I think, to start moving things. And the reason we take that approach as well, I should really point out, is that my view at least is not that we're not going to solve this problem this year or next year or even this decade, right? This problem's going to be with us for many decades yet. And the best interests of humanity and nations is served by creating a constituency with a grasp of the facts, because otherwise you make the wrong decisions, right? And that's a slow process. We only get out, we might speak to 200 people in Ipswich or Port Macquarie or Geelong at a time and use the local media to amplify the message and so forth. It's a painfully slow process. But in a democracy like ours, I can't see another way forward. You know, face-to-face meetings with people who are sceptical, who only get to read the Murdoch press on these issues and so forth, is invaluable.
Just to conclude, really, thank you. It's been great, as always, to have you, and I'm extremely grateful for your contribution today.
Thank you, Robert, and thanks for coming.